The bullet tore through the air like a streak of lightning, slamming into the girl's chest with a force that knocked her off her feet. Her body crumpled onto the cold pavement, her arms sprawled out, eyes wide with shock and pain. A choked gasp escaped her lips, blood bubbling at the corners of her mouth as her breath hitched. The cop, Officer Randall Briggs, stood frozen, his gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. His pulse pounded in his ears. For a second, the world around him disappeared. No more streetlights flickering above, no more distant hum of the city, no more sirens wailing in the night. Just him and the girl on the ground, her life spilling onto the cracked concrete. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Someone was rushing towards them. His instinct screamed at him to raise his gun again, to keep control of the situation. But then he saw who it was. The mayor. Mayor Charles Eaton, a man known for his iron will and sharp tongue, was running toward the girl, his daughter. His face twisted in horror. Briggs' heart stopped. His throat went dry. Then the mayor let out a scream that would haunt Briggs for the rest of his life. It had started as a routine patrol. That's what Briggs would tell himself later. Just another night in Glenhurst, a city that had been changing too fast for his liking. The new mayor, Eaton, had been pushing for reforms, talking about cleaning up the corruption in the police force, bringing in fresh leadership, making things fair. To Briggs, it was all just political talk, a bunch of nonsense that didn't change the reality on the ground. He had been a cop for 20 years. He knew how the city worked. Some people didn't belong in certain places, and it was his job to make sure they stayed in their lane. That's why when he saw the girl walking through the gates of Holloway Park after hours, he didn't think twice. A black girl alone, in a private park? It didn't add up. He hit the brakes hard, the patrol car screeching to a stop. His fingers twitched over the grip of his gun. The city had been on edge lately. Protests, complaints against officers, people filming everything with their damn phones. He wasn't about to take chances. "Hey, you," he barked, stepping out of the vehicle. "You can't be here." The girl turned. She was young, maybe 16 or 17. She had on a hoodie, dark jeans, sneakers. Nothing threatening, but Briggs had seen enough to know that trouble didn't always dress the part. She didn't look scared, though. That set him off immediately. "I said you can't be here," he repeated, stepping closer. "I'm just passing through," she said, calm, like she didn't have a care in the world. Briggs narrowed his eyes. "Not your park. Turn around." "I don't have to," she said. "This is a public space." Briggs' jaw tightened. He didn't like being talked back to, especially by people like her. "This park is private property after dark," he snapped. "That means you're trespassing." She sighed, like she was dealing with a child. "I live right down the street. My dad's the—" "I don't care who your dad is," Briggs cut in. "Step back." That's when she did something that made his blood boil. She smiled. A slow, knowing smile, like she had the upper hand. Like she wasn't afraid of him. Briggs clenched his teeth. He had dealt with this before. Kids who thought they were untouchable, who thought the rules didn't apply to them. And every time, he made sure they learned otherwise. "I'm gonna ask you one last time," he said, voice low. "Turn around. Put your hands where I can see them." The girl sighed again and reached into her pocket. That's when everything went red. Briggs' instincts took over. He didn't wait to see what she was pulling out. He didn't wait to ask questions. His training kicked in, the same training that had been drilled into him for years. Threat detected. Neutralize immediately. He pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot rang through the empty park. The girl jerked backward, her legs giving out beneath her. Something small and shiny slipped from her fingers, landing on the ground with a soft clink. A phone. Briggs stared at it, his breath coming in short gasps. A phone. Not a weapon. Not a gun. Oh, God. His heart pounded as the weight of what he'd done settled over him. He had just shot an unarmed girl. A girl who had been smiling at him just moments ago. Then he heard it. The sound of footsteps pounding on the pavement. A voice, deep, frantic, desperate, roared through the night. New. Briggs turned in time to see a man charging toward them, his suit flapping behind him, his eyes wild with terror. It took him a second to recognize the face. Mayor Charles Eaton. Briggs' stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. The girl on the ground wasn't just anyone. She was the mayor's daughter, and he had just shot her. The world seemed to slow down. The mayor dropped to his knees beside his daughter, shaking her, his hands pressing against the bleeding wound in her chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, his face pale with shock. Briggs took a step back, his gun still in his hand. His mind raced. His training told him to secure the scene, to call it in, to take control of the situation. But this wasn't a situation. This was a disaster. The mayor's hands were slick with blood as he cradled his daughter's face. "Stay with me, baby," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Stay with me." Briggs' mouth opened, but no words came out. The girl coughed weakly, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at her father, confusion flickering in her gaze. "Dad?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here," the mayor said. "I'm right here." Briggs' grip tightened on his gun. He had to think. He had to act. There were no cameras around, no witnesses except the mayor. Maybe he could fix this. Maybe he could say she reached for something, make it look justified. But then, a light. From the darkness of the park, a glow appeared. Someone had been filming. Briggs' stomach dropped. The shaky, distant screen showed everything. The girl reaching for her phone, the cop raising his gun, the shot, the mayor running in. Briggs turned his head sharply. He spotted a figure standing near a tree, holding up a phone. He couldn't see their face, but he saw the red blinking light. They were still recording. His breath caught in his throat. He was screwed. And that's when the sirens started wailing in the distance. The wail of the sirens grew louder, piercing the night air like a death knell. Blue and red lights flickered through the trees, casting eerie shadows across the blood-stained pavement. The mayor still knelt over his daughter, his expensive suit smeared with her blood, his hands trembling as he pressed down on her wound. Briggs' heart pounded. His mind raced. He was a cop. He knew how this would play out. The second those other officers arrived, the questions would start. The report would have to be filed. And that video? Whoever was recording. If that got out, his career, his freedom, maybe even his life as he knew it, would be over. He had to think. Fast. His fingers clenched around his gun. One bullet. If he could just... "Don't you dare." The mayor's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. Briggs froze. Eaton's eyes burned with fury, his face contorted in pure rage. "Put the gun down now." His voice was low, dangerous. For a split second, Briggs thought about running. He could bolt into the trees, disappear before the other officers got here, say he was attacked. But before he could act, the first police car screeched to a stop behind him. Doors slammed. Officers rushed out, weapons drawn. "Drop your weapon." Hands in the air. Briggs snapped back to reality. They weren't aiming at some suspect in the dark. They were aiming at him. His pulse spiked. He was one of them, a fellow officer. But the way they were looking at him, the way their fingers tensed over their triggers, he realized in an instant that he wasn't safe. Not anymore. Slowly, he raised his hands, his gun slipping from his grip and clattering onto the pavement. The officers moved in fast. One of them, Sergeant Olivia Carter, a no-nonsense black woman who had never liked him, shoved him hard against his own patrol car. His face smacked the cold metal. "Don't move," she hissed in his ear as she yanked his arms behind his back. Briggs gritted his teeth. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one giving orders, the one in control. Not this. Not this. As she slapped the cuffs onto his wrists, his eyes darted toward the mayor. Eaton hadn't moved from his daughter's side. Paramedics were now surrounding her, working fast, checking her pulse, their voices a blur of urgency. Briggs saw the girl's lips move. She was alive. Barely. His stomach twisted. If she survived, if she talked? No. His gaze shifted toward the trees. The figure with the phone was still there, still recording. Briggs' heart dropped. That video was the end of him. But before he could do anything, before he could even think, another cop grabbed him and dragged him toward a squad car. He barely had time to process what was happening before he was shoved inside. The door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the back seat like a common criminal. His breath came fast. He could feel sweat dripping down the back of his neck. He had to get out of this. He had to find a way to turn this around. But then, a sound, a voice. The voice of the mayor. "You're going to rot for this, Briggs." Briggs turned his head, meeting the man's eyes through the car window. The look Eaton gave him sent a chill straight through his bones. And that's when he knew. This wasn't just a bad night. This was the beginning of his end. Hours earlier, before the gunshot, before the sirens, before the chaos, she had only wanted to take a walk. Layla Eaton wasn't the kind of girl who got into trouble. She wasn't reckless, wasn't the type to sneak out or break the rules. But tonight, she needed to breathe, to think, to get away from the pressure of being the mayor's daughter. Her father, Charles Eaton, had been running the city for 2 years now, and it felt like every moment of her life was being watched. Every time she stepped outside, there were whispers, eyes on her, people expecting something from her. So she walked. Holloway Park was close to home. She had been there a million times before. It was peaceful at night, the kind of place where she could clear her head. She wasn't expecting trouble. She definitely wasn't expecting a cop to roll up on her like she was some kind of criminal. When the patrol car screeched to a stop, her first instinct was confusion, then annoyance. Then, when the cop stepped out and barked at her, anger. She had seen his type before. The kind who looked at her like she didn't belong. The kind who assumed things about her before she even opened her mouth. Layla knew her rights. She knew she wasn't doing anything wrong. But none of that mattered. Because when she reached for her phone, everything changed in an instant. The cop didn't hesitate, didn't ask, didn't even give her a second to explain. He just shot her. The pain was like fire, like lightning ripping through her chest. She hit the ground, her body screaming in agony, her mind spinning. She heard his footsteps, felt the cold pavement beneath her, saw the distant glow of a phone recording, and then, her father's voice. Everything else faded. Everything else disappeared. "Dad." She tried to say more, but her body was shutting down. The pain was too much. She felt herself slipping. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was the look of pure terror on her father's face. Back in the present, inside the squad car, Briggs stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. This wasn't over. Not yet. He could still fix this. He could still. The back door of the car suddenly yanked open. Briggs turned, expecting another officer. But it wasn't a cop. It was the mayor. And the look in his eyes was something Briggs had never seen before. A look that sent a cold, sharp blade of fear straight through his chest. Mayor Eaton stepped forward, leaned in close, and in a voice so low, so dangerous, that only Briggs could hear, he whispered, "You have no idea what's coming for you." Then he slammed the door shut. Briggs swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, he was afraid. Briggs sat stiff in the back seat of the squad car, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The mayor's words echoed in his head, over and over again. "You have no idea what's coming for you." This wasn't just about an officer-involved shooting anymore. This wasn't just another case of a cop pulling the trigger and getting away with it. This was personal. He had shot the mayor's daughter. And now, as the squad car pulled away from the scene, he realized something chilling. He wasn't going to walk away from this like he had before. No cover-up, no union backing him up, no smooth-talking lawyer spinning a story that would turn public opinion in his favor. No, this time, he was screwed. The car rumbled through the darkened streets, the flashing lights casting eerie patterns on the buildings. Briggs tried to slow his breathing, to think. There had to be a way out of this. His mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe the mayor was bluffing. Maybe this was all heat-of-the-moment rage. Maybe by the time they got to the station, the usual process would play out. Paid leave, an investigation that led nowhere, a press conference with carefully chosen words like unfortunate and tragic. But deep down, he knew better. Something about the way Eaton had looked at him, the raw hatred in his eyes, made Briggs' skin crawl. This wasn't just another case. This was war. At the hospital, Layla Eaton was fighting for her life. Surgeons worked frantically, their hands moving with urgency as they tried to repair the damage. The bullet had torn through her left lung, barely missing her heart. She had lost a lot of blood. Too much. Outside the emergency room, Charles Eaton stood motionless, staring through the glass window with dead eyes. His daughter, his baby girl, was in there, clinging to life because of a man who had sworn to serve and protect. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. It didn't matter what the police report would say. It didn't matter how they tried to spin this. Briggs had shot her without hesitation. He had seen the footage. Someone had sent it to him before the cops could even try to suppress it. The shaky video, taken from the shadows, showed everything. The way Layla had barely moved before Briggs pulled the trigger. The way she had crumpled to the ground, blood spilling from her chest. The way Briggs had stood over her, gun still raised, like she was nothing. Charles Eaton had seen a lot of things in his time as mayor. Corruption, greed, injustice. But nothing had ever ignited a fire in his chest like this. Briggs had taken the wrong shot. And now, Eaton was going to make sure he paid for it. Inside the squad car, Briggs' hands were slick with sweat. His mind was racing. He needed a plan. He couldn't just sit here and let them book him like some common criminal. They would try to make an example of him. The media would eat this up. Racist cop shoots unarmed black girl. He knew how these things went. Once the public got involved, there was no stopping it. He had to get ahead of this. He had to control the story. Suddenly, the car took a sharp turn. Briggs frowned. They weren't heading toward the station. Something wasn't right. He leaned forward, straining to see through the windshield. The streetlights blurred past, unfamiliar buildings flashing by. He didn't recognize this part of the city. He swallowed hard. Hey, where the hell are we going? The cop driving, Sergeant Olivia Carter, didn't answer. The officer in the passenger seat, Daniels, didn't either. Briggs' stomach tightened. Something was wrong. Hey, I'm talking to you, he barked, his voice laced with panic. Where are you taking me? Carter's eyes met his in the rearview mirror. Cold. Unreadable. You'll see, she said flatly. Briggs' pulse skyrocketed. He yanked at the door handle, but it was locked. His body tensed. He was a cop. He knew what this looked like. They weren't taking him to the station. They were taking him somewhere else. Somewhere no cameras would see. Somewhere no rules applied. And for the first time in his life, Briggs knew what it felt like to be truly afraid. At the hospital, the waiting room was packed. Reporters, city officials, police officers, and community leaders stood in tense silence, waiting for updates. The news had spread like wildfire. Outside, a crowd had already begun to gather. Protesters held up signs. Say her name, Layla Eaton. Justice for Layla. No more killer cops. The tension in the air was suffocating. Inside, Charles Eaton didn't move from his spot. His hands were still curled into fists. His mind was a storm. Then, a voice pulled him back to the present. Sir. He turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit. Marcus Greer. A name that struck fear into men like Randall Briggs. Greer wasn't just anyone. He was the kind of man who handled things. Eaton exhaled slowly. You saw the video? Greer nodded once. Eaton's voice was deadly quiet. And Greer's lips pressed into a thin line. I have men watching every officer in that precinct, he said. They're moving Briggs now. He won't make it to booking. Eaton's jaw tightened. They're taking him somewhere off the grid, Greer continued. Somewhere. We can deal with him properly. Eaton inhaled deeply. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice so calm it was almost terrifying, he said, make sure he understands exactly what he did. Greer nodded once. Consider it done. Eaton turned back toward the emergency room, watching the doctors work on his daughter. His heart was heavy. His rage was cold. Tonight, Randall Briggs had learned what it felt like to be powerless. But by the time this was over, he would learn what it felt like to pay. Briggs' breath came in ragged gasps as the squad car sped through the dark, unfamiliar streets. His mind screamed at him. This isn't protocol. They weren't taking him to the station. They weren't booking him. No, this was something else. Something worse. He struggled against the handcuffs, the cold metal biting into his wrists. Where the hell are we going? He demanded, his voice laced with fear. Carter didn't answer. Neither did Daniels. They just kept driving. Briggs' pulse pounded in his ears. He had been a cop long enough to recognize the feeling creeping up his spine. This was a setup, a hit, and he was the target. His throat went dry. "Carter," he tried again, forcing his voice to sound controlled. "You can't do this. You know that, right?" Carter's hands gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles white. Still no answer. Daniels, usually the loud-mouthed, easygoing type, sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Briggs' panic deepened. He knew Carter. Knew she was the kind of cop who always played by the rules. So why the hell was she going along with this? Then it hit him. This wasn't just about Layla Eaton. This was bigger. Mayor Eaton was making a statement. Briggs had been in the department long enough to know the dirty secrets that ran through Glenhust. He had always thought he was untouchable, that the system would protect him no matter what. But now he was the example. He had shot the mayor's daughter, and they were making sure he paid for it. The car turned sharply, jolting Briggs to the side. He caught a glimpse of a rusted chain-link fence through the window, an abandoned industrial area just beyond it. His stomach twisted. They weren't just taking him off the books. They were taking him off the map. He had to act now. His mind snapped into survival mode. The second they stopped, he'd fight. He'd kick, bite, do whatever it took to break free. He wasn't going out like this. Not without a fight. The car screeched to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, the back door swung open. Blinding light poured in. A shadowy figure stood outside, silhouetted against the headlights. Briggs squinted, trying to make out the face. Then his blood turned to ice. It wasn't just anyone. It was Marcus Greer, the mayor's enforcer, the man who handled problems that couldn't be solved with politics. Briggs' pulse skyrocketed. Greer leaned down, his massive frame filling the doorway. His voice was low, gravelly. "Out." Briggs' body locked up. He knew what happened to people who got dragged to places like this. They disappeared. Forever. "No." Briggs breathed. His voice was barely above a whisper. Greer smirked. "Wrong answer." Then, before Briggs could react, a fist slammed into his ribs. Pain exploded through his body. Briggs doubled over, gasping for air. Rough hands grabbed him, yanking him out of the car. His knees hit the dirt, the impact sending shockwaves up his legs. He tried to get up, but another blow landed across his face, snapping his head to the side. Blood filled his mouth. The metallic taste made his stomach churn. He spat onto the ground, his vision spinning. Greer crouched down in front of him, his dark eyes cold. "You like shooting kids, huh?" he murmured. Briggs wheezed, trying to form words. "I." A sharp kick to his stomach sent him sprawling. His body convulsed, the pain overwhelming. Greer sighed, like he was disappointed. "See, I was hoping you'd fight back," he said. "Would have made this more fun." Briggs coughed, struggling to breathe. Daniels and Carter stood nearby, their faces unreadable. They weren't stopping this. They weren't helping him. They were letting it happen. Greer grabbed a fistful of Briggs' hair, yanking his head up. "I want you to understand something," he said, his voice a deadly whisper. "Layla Eaton is fighting for her life in that hospital because of you." Briggs winced, his ribs screaming in agony. "You didn't hesitate," Greer continued. "Didn't even think twice before pulling that trigger." His grip tightened. "So tell me, Briggs, how does it feel to be on the other side?" Briggs' mouth opened, but nothing came out. He could barely breathe. Greer leaned in close, his breath hot against Briggs' ear. "You're done," he whispered. "You just don't know it yet." Then he let Briggs collapsed onto the dirt, his vision fading in and out. Somewhere in the distance, he heard Carter's voice. "That's enough." Greer chuckled. "You getting soft on me, Sergeant?" Carter didn't answer. Briggs lay still, his body screaming in pain. He had to find a way out of this. He had to. Bang. A gunshot split the night air. Briggs' body tensed. Then, a second shot. A third. Chaos erupted. Daniel shouted something. Carter cursed. Greer spun around, reaching for his gun. More shots. Briggs barely had time to process what was happening before the darkness swallowed him whole. Briggs' consciousness flickered like a dying light bulb. Sound warped in and out, shouted voices, hurried footsteps, the distant echo of gunfire. His body screamed in pain, but his mind struggled to keep up, to understand what the hell was happening. 1 second, he was on the ground, barely breathing. The next, gunshots. Then chaos. His eyes fluttered open, and the world swam around him in a haze of red and black. He saw figures moving, shadows darting between the flickering headlights. Greer had his gun out, barking orders. Daniels was slumped against the car, his body limp. Carter. Where was Carter? Briggs tried to move, but agony ripped through his ribs. His body wasn't listening. Then, more gunfire. Close. Too close. Something thudded to the ground near him. A body. His breath hitched. He forced his head to turn, his vision sharpening just enough to see. Greer. Sprawled on the dirt, blood pooling beneath him. Dead. Briggs' heart slammed against his ribs. What the hell was going on? A shadow loomed over him. His breath caught. He braced for another hit, for more pain. But the figure crouched down instead. A voice. Calm. Familiar. Get up. Briggs' eyes focused. Carter. Her expression was stone cold, her gun still raised. Briggs blinked, his mind scrambling to catch up. What? He croaked. Carter didn't answer. She reached down, grabbed his arm, and yanked him to his feet. Pain exploded through his ribs, but fear overrode it. Briggs swayed, his body weak, his thoughts tangled. What the hell just happened? He gasped. Carter scanned the area. Daniels wasn't moving. Greer was dead. Who had fired first? Briggs' pulse pounded. He was sure it wasn't him. Carter's jaw was tight. We don't have time for this, she snapped. We need to move. Briggs' brain still wasn't working at full speed. Move where? He asked, staggering. Carter's grip on her gun tightened. Somewhere the mayor's people can't find you. Briggs froze. Her words hit like a sledgehammer to his skull. She wasn't supposed to be helping him. She was supposed to be finishing him. What are you? Carter grabbed him again, shoving him forward. Do you want to live or not? Briggs' lips parted, but he couldn't form words. Live. Right now, that was all that mattered. The rest? He'd figure out later. Behind them, sirens wailed in the distance. The city was waking up to the blood spilled tonight. Briggs staggered forward, following Carter into the shadows. He had no idea what the hell was happening, but one thing was clear. Everything had just changed, and it was only the beginning. Briggs' legs felt like lead, every step sending fresh waves of pain through his ribs. His head was spinning, his body barely holding together, but Carter didn't slow down. She gripped his arm tight, practically dragging him through the maze of abandoned warehouses and crumbling industrial buildings. Somewhere behind them, sirens screamed through the night. More cops. More of Eaton's people. If they caught him now, he wouldn't make it out alive. Briggs forced himself to push forward, every breath a knife in his side. Where the hell are we going? He rasped. Carter didn't answer. She didn't slow down, didn't even look at him. Briggs' mind was a mess. Why was she doing this? Just an hour ago, she had been ready to throw him in a cage. Now she was leading him away from the bodies, away from the mayor's wrath. Why? He wasn't stupid. He knew no one helped a man like him out of the kindness of their heart. Carter had an angle, and he needed to figure out what it was fast. They reached a rusted-out chain-link fence. Carter stopped, scanning their surroundings before crouching down. She yanked up a loose section of the fence and motioned for Briggs to crawl through. He hesitated. She shot him a look. You can die here if you want, she snapped. That was all the motivation he needed. Gritting his teeth, Briggs dropped to the ground and dragged himself through the gap. His arms shook with the effort, his muscles screaming in protest. The second he was on the other side, Carter followed, letting the fence fall back into place. They were behind another warehouse now, the city lights a distant glow on the horizon. Briggs collapsed against the wall, gulping in air. His chest burned, his vision swimming. He was running on fumes. Carter stood over him, her expression unreadable. Briggs wiped the sweat from his forehead, his hand coming away smeared with blood. He swallowed hard. Okay, he wheezed. You gonna tell me what the hell is going on? Carter crossed her arms. You're dead, Briggs. He blinked, confused. What? You. are dead. Her voice was sharp, final. That's what everyone is gonna think. Briggs stared at her. It took a second for her words to sink in. His stomach dropped. They weren't escaping. She was disappearing him. His heart slammed against his ribs. No, he said, shaking his head. Hell no. I'm not just gonna disappear. You don't have a choice. Briggs pushed himself upright, ignoring the pain in his body. Like hell I don't, he snapped. I'm a cop. I have rights. I can fight this. Carter let out a short, humorless laugh. You think Eaton's gonna let you stand trial? You think this is about justice? She shook her head. No, Briggs. He doesn't want you behind bars. He wants you gone. Briggs clenched his jaw. She was right. If the mayor had his way, he'd never make it to a courtroom. He'd end up in a ditch somewhere, his body never found. And now Carter had just given him one way out. Faking his death. Starting over. Running. Briggs swallowed hard, his throat dry. Why are you doing this? He asked, watching her closely. Carter's expression darkened. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I'm doing this because I know how this city works. If the mayor takes you out, it won't stop there. It'll set a precedent. Cops disappearing. Justice handled in the shadows. Her jaw tightened. I won't let that happen. Briggs exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. He didn't trust her. Not fully. But right now, she was his only way out. His only shot at surviving this mess. All right, he muttered, leaning back against the wall. His head was spinning. He needed to think. Carter checked her watch. We don't have long before they find the bodies. We need to move. Briggs looked up at her. There was one thing still bothering him. What about Daniels? He asked. Carter didn't answer right away. Then, he's dead. Briggs felt a chill crawl up his spine. Dead. Just like Greer. Did you? Carter cut him off. Does it matter? Briggs stared at her. A few hours ago, Carter had been just another cop. Someone he worked with. Someone he thought he understood. But now he wasn't sure who the hell she really was. Or if he could trust her at all. Still, he didn't have a choice. Not anymore. Carter turned, motioning for him to follow. Come on. Briggs exhaled slowly. Then he pushed off the wall and walked into the darkness. He didn't know where he was going. But he knew one thing for sure. His old life was over. And something far worse was waiting for him on the other side. Briggs followed Carter through the darkened streets, every step sending fresh jolts of pain through his battered body. His ribs ached, his face throbbed, and his mind felt like it was on the verge of shutting down. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when every cop in the city was either looking to arrest him, or worse, bury him. They moved quickly, slipping through alleyways, cutting through abandoned lots. The industrial district gave way to crumbling brick buildings and flickering streetlights, the kind of neighborhood where people knew better than to ask questions. Finally, Carter stopped in front of a rusted metal door tucked between two boarded-up shops. She pulled out a key and shoved it into the lock. Briggs hesitated. What is this? He asked, eyeing the door warily. Carter glanced over her shoulder. A safe house, she said. At least for now. Briggs' jaw tightened. For who? Carter didn't answer. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Briggs hesitated for half a second before following. Inside, the place was barely more than a single room. Concrete walls, a sagging couch, a table with an old laptop on it. A small bathroom in the corner, the door slightly ajar. It was clear this place had been used before. Carter closed the door behind them and locked it. Then she exhaled, rubbing her forehead. Briggs sat down heavily on the couch, wincing as his ribs protested. You gonna tell me the plan now? He asked. Carter leaned against the table, crossing her arms. You don't have a plan, Briggs, she said flatly. You're dead, remember? Briggs scowled. I'm still breathing. For now. Silence stretched between them. Briggs exhaled sharply. I need to know why you're doing this, he said. You could have handed me over. Hell, you should have. Carter looked at him for a long moment. Then, I know what it's like to have the system turn against you, she said quietly. Briggs frowned. What are you talking about? Carter didn't answer right away. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. You remember Jamal Harris? Briggs blinked. The name was familiar. Then it hit him. The shooting. A kid, black, unarmed, gunned down by a cop in a so-called misunderstanding. The officer had claimed self-defense. No charges were filed. It was just another name on the growing list of people killed by police. Briggs had barely paid attention to the case back then. But now, seeing the way Carter's expression hardened, it clicked. "You knew him," he said. Carter's eyes flashed. "He was my nephew." Briggs felt his stomach drop. He opened his mouth, but Carter cut him off. "You want to know why I'm doing this?" she said, her voice sharp. "Because I've seen how this city works. I've seen what happens when the wrong people get killed and the right people get away with it." She leaned forward. "You thought you were one of the right people, didn't you?" Briggs clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure what to say. Carter shook her head. "Eaton's gonna tear this city apart looking for you," she said. "You think people hate cops now? Wait until that video goes public." Briggs tensed. "The video?" His pulse spiked. "Who has it?" he asked. Carter narrowed her eyes. "You mean, who's gonna release it?" Briggs swallowed hard. "I need to know." Carter let out a dry laugh. "Why? So you can try to stop it?" Briggs didn't answer. Because the truth was, yes. If that video got out, there was no coming back. No union lawyer could spin it. No department PR statement could clean it up. It would be the end of him. Carter must have seen something in his expression because her gaze turned cold. "That video is the only thing keeping you alive," she said. Briggs frowned. "What are you talking about?" Carter leaned back. "Think about it. If you just disappeared, Eaton wouldn't need to justify anything. He could blame it on the streets. Say someone got revenge. Case closed." Briggs' breath hitched. "But with the video?" Carter continued. "With people watching? Eaton can't just erase you. He has to be careful." Briggs exhaled slowly. She was right. If the video got released, Eaton wouldn't be the only one after him. The whole damn city would be. Briggs ran a hand down his face, his pulse pounding. He needed a way out. But there was no way out. Not anymore. Carter stood up. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow, we figure out what's next." Briggs let out a bitter laugh. "Tomorrow?" he muttered. "I might not make it till then." Carter didn't respond. She just walked toward the door, checked the locks, then sat down at the table, watching him like a hawk. Briggs leaned back against the couch, his body aching, his mind racing. He had spent years thinking he was untouchable. Now, he was a dead man walking. And the worst part? He deserved it. Briggs barely slept. His body screamed for rest, but his mind wouldn't shut off. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Layla Eaton lying on the pavement, blood pooling beneath her. He heard the gunshot, heard the mayor's scream. He was trapped in a loop, a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. When dawn finally crept through the grimy windows of the safe house, he sat up, groaning as his ribs protested. Carter was still at the table, sipping from a styrofoam cup of coffee. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Briggs rubbed his face, his head pounding. "Tell me we have a plan." Carter didn't look at him. "We need to get you out of the city." Briggs exhaled sharply. "And go where?" "You think Eaton doesn't have people everywhere?" Carter finally met his eyes. "We don't have a choice." Briggs clenched his jaw. "We? Don't act like you're in this with me, Carter." Carter narrowed her eyes. "I just threw my career away saving your ass," she said. "I'm in it now." Briggs leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. He didn't trust her. Not completely. But she was right. She had made a choice. And now they were both in the crosshairs. "Fine," he muttered. "What's the move?" Carter set her coffee down. "There's a man, Elijah Ward. Used to be a fixer for some dirty cops before he disappeared." Briggs frowned. "Disappeared?" Carter smirked. "He disappeared himself. New identity, new life. If anyone can do the same for you, it's him." Briggs exhaled slowly. "And how the hell do we find him?" Carter pulled out a burner phone and slid it across the table. "We don't. He finds us." Briggs stared at the phone. It was cheap, old, something that couldn't be traced. Carter took a deep breath. "I already sent out a feeler last night. If he's willing to meet, we'll get a time and place soon." Briggs ran a hand through his hair. It was a long shot, but it was something. Then, A knock at the door. Briggs' entire body went rigid. Carter was already reaching for her gun. Silence. Then, another knock. Briggs' heart pounded. This wasn't good. No one should know they were here. Carter motioned for him to stay put as she moved to the door. She pressed her ear against the metal, listening. Another knock. This time, softer. Then a voice. I know you're in there. Briggs' breath caught in his throat. Because he knew that voice. Carter shot him a look. Briggs' mouth went dry. It was Charles Eaton, the mayor, the man who wanted him dead. Briggs felt his pulse skyrocket. How the hell had Eaton found them? Carter stayed silent. She didn't open the door. Eaton sighed from the other side. I know you think you can run, he said. His voice was calm, but there was something deadly underneath it. But there's nowhere to go. No hole deep enough. Briggs swallowed hard. Eaton's voice got lower. You have one chance, Briggs. Open this door, face the consequences, and maybe, I'll let you live. Briggs' fingers curled into fists. He looked at Carter. Her hand was gripping her gun, but she didn't move. She was waiting for him to decide. Eaton let out a soft chuckle. I know you, Briggs. You've always been a survivor, but you need to understand something. A pause. Then, you shot my daughter. My baby girl. Briggs' chest tightened. Eaton's voice turned cold. You don't get to survive this. Silence. Then, a scrape. A shadow moved under the door. Eaton was sliding something inside. Briggs frowned. Then, he saw it. A phone. The same phone Layla had dropped the night he shot her. Briggs' breath caught. The video? He locked eyes with Carter. Eaton's voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. Watch it, Briggs. Then, footsteps. Getting softer. Fading. Briggs' entire body was stiff. Carter waited a few more seconds before picking up the phone. She turned it over in her hands. It was on. Briggs felt like he couldn't breathe. Carter sat back down and placed the phone between them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Carter pressed play, and everything changed. The screen flickered to life. The video was shaky, but clear enough. Briggs saw himself, standing in Holloway Park, gun raised. He saw Layla, saw the exact moment she reached for her pocket. Briggs' breath hitched. He had been so sure, so damn sure. But then, his stomach dropped. Layla wasn't reaching for a gun. She wasn't reaching for a weapon. She was reaching for a badge. Briggs' head spun. No, that's not possible. But it was right there. On the screen, Layla was pulling out a small, silver badge. His heart felt like it stopped. A mayor's identification badge. Not a gun. Not a threat. He had shot the mayor's daughter while she was trying to show him who she was. Briggs' hands shook. Carter was staring at the screen, her face unreadable. Briggs felt like he was going to be sick. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Eaton had known. That's why he left the phone. That's why he wanted Briggs to see. Briggs hadn't just shot an unarmed black girl. He had shot the wrong one. And now, the man who ran this city was going to make sure he paid. Carter slowly turned to look at him. Briggs felt cold all over. There was no way out of this. Not anymore. Briggs stared at the screen, his body frozen, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The truth was right there, playing out in front of him. Layla Eaton hadn't just been an innocent girl walking through the park that night. She had been trying to show him who she was, and he had shot her for it. The sickening realization made his stomach twist. He had thought, no, assumed, that she was reaching for something dangerous. But it had been a badge. Her father's badge. The daughter of the most powerful man in the city had tried to identify herself, and he had gunned her down anyway. Briggs clenched his jaw, while rising in his throat. The room was silent, the weight of the truth settling over them like a suffocating fog. Carter finally spoke, her voice quiet but sharp. Well, she muttered, guess that settles it. Briggs swallowed hard, his mind spiraling. This doesn't change anything, he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew how weak they sounded. Carter scoffed. Doesn't change anything? She shook her head in disbelief. Are you serious right now? Briggs ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. I didn't know, Carter. I thought she... You thought? Carter's voice sharpened. You didn't know. And you shot her anyway. Briggs exhaled shakily. His head was pounding. His entire body felt like it was caving in on itself. Carter sat back, arms crossed, studying him. You tell me, she said. If that had been a white girl reaching for something, would you have fired that fast? Briggs' jaw locked. Don't lie to me, Carter added coldly. Because we both know the answer. Briggs didn't respond. He didn't want to answer that question, because he already knew the truth. And that truth was damning. His breath came heavier, his pulse erratic. His mind screamed for a way out, for something, anything, to make this situation less of a nightmare. But there was no way to twist this, no way to spin it. The video had sealed his fate. Eaton knew it. Carter knew it. And now, so did Briggs. His entire body tensed as a new, horrifying realization settled in. Eaton hadn't come here to kill him. Not yet. No, the mayor had done something far worse. He had let him see it, had let him feel it. The guilt, the shame, the slow-burning horror of knowing exactly what he had done. This wasn't just revenge. This was punishment. Briggs' breathing hitched. His hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. Carter leaned forward slightly, studying him. So, she said, what are you gonna do now? Briggs exhaled sharply, his throat dry. What could he do? He could run, disappear. Let Carter's fixer set him up with a new identity, a new life. But even if he made it out of Glenhurst alive, he'd never be free. Not really. Because this wouldn't just go away. The video would be released. The city would see it. And they would never stop looking for him. Briggs squeezed his eyes shut, his mind racing. He had spent years enforcing his version of justice. Now, justice was coming for him. He could hear Eaton's voice in his head. Low, quiet, filled with ice. You don't get to survive this. Briggs opened his eyes. There was only one thing left to do. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. I need to talk to Eaton. Carter blinked. Are you insane? Briggs met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Maybe. Carter shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. You think he's gonna talk? He wants you dead, Briggs. Briggs inhaled deeply. His ribs ached with every breath. I know. Carter stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, she let out a bitter laugh. Wow, she muttered. For the first time in your life, you actually get it? Briggs didn't respond. Because deep down, he knew. There was no escaping this. No fixing it. No running. The only way out of this mess was straight through the fire. And if Eaton wanted him dead, then so be it. Carter stared at Briggs like he had lost his damn mind. You want to talk to Eaton? She repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Briggs, this man has every cop, every street enforcer, and half the city looking to put you in the ground. And you want to walk into his office? Briggs leaned forward, his hands clasped together, his ribs screaming in protest. But the pain didn't matter. None of it did. He had made his decision. I shot his daughter, he said, his voice hollow. I need to face him. Carter let out a humorless laugh. You need to survive, Briggs. What part of that don't you get? Briggs shook his head. You don't understand. Eaton doesn't want me dead. Carter's brows furrowed. What the hell are you talking about? Briggs clenched his jaw, his mind working through the pieces. If he wanted me dead, I'd already be in a body bag. Carter scoffed. You sure about that? Briggs exhaled sharply. He left me that phone. He wanted me to see the video, to know what I did. His throat tightened. He doesn't just want revenge. He wants me to feel it. Carter leaned back in her chair, watching him carefully. And then what? She muttered. You think if you say you're sorry, he's just gonna let you go? Briggs shook his head. No, but I don't think this is about letting me go. Carter studied him for a long moment. Then, you're serious? Briggs nodded. She sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over her face. You are out of your goddamn mind. Briggs managed a small, bitter smirk. Yeah, well, took me long enough to realize it. Carter shook her head, exhaling. All right. Say I don't shoot you myself for being stupid. How do you plan on getting to Eaton? You think you can just walk into City Hall? Briggs leaned forward. No, but I think I know where he'll be. Carter raised a brow. And where's that? Briggs exhaled. The hospital. Silence. Carter frowned. Briggs continued. Layla's still alive. And if there's one place Eaton won't leave, it's her bedside. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. You're betting your life on that? Briggs gave her a cold, tired look. I already lost my life, Carter. Carter didn't argue. Because they both knew. He was right. Getting into the hospital wasn't going to be easy. By now, the place would be swarming with cops, security, and Eaton's people. If Briggs walked in, he'd be dead before he reached the elevator. But Carter had a plan. Or at least, half of one. They needed an entry point no one would be watching. A way to get Briggs inside without setting off alarms. The hospital had 3 main entrances, all heavily guarded. But Carter knew a back way. A service tunnel beneath the building, used for emergency deliveries and medical waste disposal. It wasn't pretty, but it was their best shot. Briggs pulled a stolen hoodie over his head, wincing as his ribs protested. He wasn't in any shape for this, but pain didn't matter anymore. He was walking straight into the lion's den. Either he was coming out with some kind of resolution, or not at all. The tunnel was damp and smelled like antiseptic and rot. Carter led the way, moving quickly but cautiously. The underground path was rarely used except for hospital staff, which meant no cops, no guards, just silence. Briggs' heart pounded. He wasn't afraid of dying, but he was afraid of what came after. Afraid of facing Layla, of seeing what he had done with his own eyes, afraid of hearing her voice, if she could even still speak. Carter stopped at a steel door, pulling out a stolen security badge. She swiped it through the scanner. A soft beep. Then, the door clicked open. Carter shot Briggs a look. Last chance to run. Briggs swallowed. Then, he stepped inside. The hospital hallway was quiet. Too quiet. They had entered through the lower level, away from the chaos above. But Briggs could feel the tension in the air. Upstairs, Eaton was waiting, and Briggs was walking straight toward him. Carter moved beside him, her hand resting near the gun, tucked under her jacket. If this goes sideways, she muttered, I'm not dying for you. Briggs nodded. I don't expect you to. They reached the service elevator. Carter pressed the button. Briggs exhaled. His fingers twitched. This was it. The doors slid open, and they stepped inside. Briggs pressed the button for the ICU floor. Carter shifted beside him. You got a plan? Briggs let out a slow breath. I'm gonna do what I should have done from the beginning. Carter eyed him. And what's that? Briggs looked up as the elevator doors closed. I'm gonna face the truth. The elevator began to rise. And for the first time in his life, Briggs didn't know if he was coming back down. The elevator hummed softly as it climbed toward the ICU floor, but to Briggs, it sounded like a war drum. His heart pounded in his chest. Each second that passed felt like a countdown to something inevitable. Carter stood beside him, her expression unreadable. The gun tucked beneath her jacket was a reminder that she was still deciding if she was going to let this play out, or put a bullet in him if things went sideways. Briggs didn't blame her. He was still figuring out if he deserved to make it out of this alive. The doors slid open. The hospital hallway was dimly lit, the soft beeping of machines echoing from nearby rooms. But Briggs barely noticed, because standing at the end of the hall was him, Charles Eaton. The mayor stood rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. He wasn't alone. 2 men in suits, bodyguards, flanked him, their eyes locked onto Briggs the moment he stepped out of the elevator. The tension in the air was suffocating. Briggs forced himself forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. Eaton didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Carter stayed close, her fingers twitching near her gun. When Briggs was only a few feet away, Eaton finally spoke. You've got some nerve. His voice was calm, too calm. Briggs swallowed. His throat was dry. I had to see her. Eaton let out a quiet chuckle, low, bitter. You had to? He took a slow step forward. You think you deserve that? Briggs said nothing. Eaton's jaw clenched. You shot my daughter. Briggs inhaled sharply. I know. Eaton's eyes burned with a fury, so controlled it was terrifying. And now you're here. What? Looking for forgiveness? Briggs' stomach twisted. No, he said honestly. I don't expect forgiveness. Eaton stared at him, his face unreadable. Then why are you here? Briggs exhaled slowly. Because I need to face this. I need to see her. And, he hesitated, I need you to look me in the eye when you decide what happens next. Eaton tilted his head slightly. Something unreadable flickered behind his eyes. Briggs knew what he was asking for. If Eaton wanted him dead, he wouldn't run. He'd accept it, because for the first time in his life, he knew he deserved it. Silence stretched between them. Then, Eaton turned slightly, motioning toward the door beside him. Briggs' breath caught in his throat. Layla's room. Briggs hesitated. Eaton's voice was like ice. You want to face this? He nodded toward the door. Then go ahead. Briggs' hands curled into fists at his sides. Then, without another word, he stepped past Eaton and into the room. The machines beeped softly. The air smelled sterile, cold, and there, lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to IVs and monitors, was her, Layla Eaton. Briggs' chest tightened painfully. She looked small, fragile, but she was alive. He took a slow step forward, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like an avalanche. He had done this. He had put her here. Layla stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. Briggs froze. Her gaze landed on him, unfocused at first. Then, recognition, and something else. Pain. Briggs' throat tightened. Layla. Her lips parted, dry and cracked. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. Briggs took another step closer. I'm sorry. His voice broke. God, I'm so. Layla blinked slowly. Then, in a weak, rasping voice, she spoke. You were gonna kill me. Briggs felt the words like a knife to his chest. He shook his head. I didn't know. Layla's expression didn't change. I told you, she whispered. I tried to tell you. Briggs squeezed his eyes shut. The guilt was suffocating. He had been so certain, so sure that night, and he had been wrong. Layla swallowed, her throat dry. But you didn't ask. Briggs opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because she was right. He hadn't asked. He had assumed. And because of that, she had almost died. Briggs' breath shuddered. He felt raw, exposed. Layla's voice was barely audible, but the weight of her words hit him harder than any bullet ever could. You saw what you wanted to see. Briggs' hands trembled, because deep down, he knew it was true. For the first time in his life, Randall Briggs truly saw himself. And he hated what he saw. A racist, a coward, a man who had nearly killed an innocent girl because of his own blind prejudice. Tears burned at the edges of his eyes. His voice cracked. I can't take it back. Layla closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, she didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with pity. And somehow that was worse. Briggs swallowed hard, turning away. He couldn't do this. He couldn't face her. He moved toward the door, his legs shaking. When he stepped back into the hallway, Eaton was still standing there, watching. Briggs met his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Briggs took a slow breath, and he knelt, right there, in front of the mayor, in front of the guards, in front of Carter. He sank to his knees, because there was nothing else left to do. Eaton didn't move, didn't speak. Briggs closed his eyes. If Eaton wanted to end this, if he wanted to pull a gun and put a bullet in him, he wouldn't fight it. Then, Eaton finally spoke. His voice was quiet, dangerous. You kneel now? A bitter laugh. After everything? Briggs stayed silent. Eaton exhaled, shaking his head. He turned to Carter. Get him out of my sight. Briggs' eyes flickered open. Eaton's gaze was cold, but there was something else there. Something undecided. Briggs swallowed hard. This wasn't over. Not yet. Eaton hadn't decided his fate, and that was terrifying. Carter grabbed Briggs' arm, pulling him up. Let's go, she muttered. Briggs let her lead him away, his legs barely working. As they moved down the hall, his mind raced. He had faced the truth. He had faced her. But the question still remained. What the hell was Eaton going to do with him now? Briggs felt like he was moving in slow motion. His legs felt like lead as Carter dragged him down the hall, away from the hospital room, away from Layla, away from Eaton's cold, burning gaze. His mind was spinning. Layla's words haunted him. You saw what you wanted to see. He had spent his entire career believing he was a good cop, a strong cop, someone who upheld the law. But the truth had been staring him in the face for years, and he had refused to see it. Now, it was too late. He had pulled the trigger. He had almost ended her, and nothing could ever undo that. Carter led him to the service elevator. The ride down was silent. When they stepped out into the underground tunnel, Briggs finally spoke. What happens now? Carter exhaled sharply. Hell if I know. Briggs leaned against the cold concrete wall, his body heavy, his ribs aching with every breath. Eaton hadn't killed him. That should have meant something. But somehow, it felt worse than if he had. Because Eaton wasn't letting him go. He was waiting. For what? Briggs had no idea. Carter checked the hallway, making sure they weren't being followed. We need to get out of here, she muttered. Before he changes his mind. Briggs didn't move. You think he will? Carter hesitated. Then, I don't know. Briggs exhaled slowly. For the first time since that night, he felt exposed, vulnerable, like a man with no future. He glanced at Carter. Why didn't he kill me? Carter's jaw tightened. Maybe because death would have been too easy. Briggs swallowed hard. She was right. If Eaton had wanted him dead, he wouldn't have walked out of that hospital. But Eaton wanted something else. Something worse. Briggs pushed off the wall, forcing himself to move. Let's go. Carter nodded, leading the way. As they disappeared into the tunnels, Briggs knew one thing for certain. His life as he knew it was over. And whatever came next was entirely in Eaton's hands. Hours later, Eaton stood in the dim hospital room, watching the steady rise and fall of Layla's chest. His daughter was alive. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. Not yet. He had seen Briggs break in front of him, seen the weight of his own guilt crush him. But that wasn't justice. Eaton wasn't satisfied. Not yet. He needed Briggs to suffer. He needed the whole world to see what he had done. A soft knock sounded at the door. Eaton didn't turn. A voice, low, steady, spoke from the doorway. We have it ready. Eaton finally looked up. Marcus Greer's replacement stood in the shadows. Eaton nodded once. The man pulled out a phone, tapping the screen. Then, the video began to upload. Eaton exhaled slowly. Randall Briggs had thought he could outrun his sins. But now, the world was about to see him for what he truly was. And this time, there would be no escape.